Eleanor Kane moved through the makeshift medical center with quiet efficiency, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding her. The colony on Vesper 9 had become a sanctuary for refugees fleeing the relentless expansion of the Silthari Empire. But safety was always a fragile illusion. The scent of antiseptic and scorched metal filled the air, a grim reminder that war never stayed far from innocent lives. Outside, the sky darkened with the arrival of an imperial vessel. The refugees whispered in fear, clutching their loved ones, some daring to peek through the ragged curtains that barely concealed the ruined buildings they now called home. The Silthari were known for their mercilessness, and their presence here, in what was supposed to be neutral ground, meant trouble. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She stepped outside into the dusty street as the heavy boots of the Silthari soldiers thundered down the gangplank of their ship. They marched in unison, clad in segmented armor that shimmered darkly under the setting sun. At their center, a towering figure emerged, Commander Vorsk. She had heard of him. The rumors painted him as a brutal enforcer, a commander who saw mercy as weakness. His reptilian features twisted into something that might have been a smile. Though on his species, it looked more like a predator bearing its fangs. He stopped a few feet away from Eleanor, scanning the scattered civilians before fixing his gaze on her. "You are the one they call Dr. Kane," Vorsk said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "You aid those who resist imperial rule." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I aid those who need it. War doesn't discriminate between soldier and child, neither do I." A murmur rippled through the gathered refugees. Some clung to each other. Others tried to make themselves smaller, less noticeable. The last time the Silthari had come to a colony like this, they had left no survivors. Vorsk chuckled, a sound like grinding stones. "How very noble and foolish." He tilted his head. "Tell me, Dr. Kane, do you know why we are here?" Eleanor's fingers curled into fists, hidden beneath the folds of her medical coat. "You want to make an example of someone. You want fear to do your work for you." Vorsk's grin widened. "Perhaps you are not so foolish after all." He raised a clawed hand, and his soldiers responded with mechanical precision, dragging a man from the crowd. He was a young father, trembling as he tried to shield his small daughter, who clung to his leg. The little girl whimpered, pressing her face into his torn sleeve. "Resistance breeds in places like this," Vorsk said, turning back to Eleanor. "Someone must answer for that." The father struggled, eyes wild with terror. "Please, she's just a child." Eleanor took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. "This is a neutral colony. Whatever grievances you think exist here, they do not justify murder. If you need someone to punish, take me." The offer hung in the air, a weight pressing down on the gathered crowd. Vorsk regarded her for a long moment, his slitted pupils narrowing. "Ah," he said slowly. "So, you would trade yourself for this nobody?" He leaned in, sniffing the air as if testing her resolve. "How human." Eleanor didn't move. "Let the people go. Take me and you'll still have your show of power." Vorsk exhaled through his nostrils, considering. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he released the father, who fell to his knees, clutching his daughter as if she were his last tether to life. The soldiers withdrew slightly, shifting their weapons but not lowering them. Vorsk stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you know the problem with humans, Dr. Kane? You believe sacrifice means something, that the universe rewards nobility." He straightened. "It does not." Eleanor had no time to react before the plasma shot rang out. Pain erupted through her chest, sharp and all-consuming. The force of the blast sent her staggering back, her body folding as she collapsed onto the hard-packed ground. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as her fingers instinctively reached for the wound, but there was no stopping it. The heat had burned straight through her. The world tilted, her vision swimming. Around her screams broke out, but they were distant, muffled. She barely registered the panicked shouts of the refugees or the cruel laughter of the Silthari soldiers. Vorsk crouched beside her, watching her struggle for breath. "The Empire does not negotiate," he murmured. "It simply takes." Eleanor coughed, blood flecking her lips. She could feel the life draining from her, but she forced herself to focus, to look him in the eyes. "You don't know what you've just done," she whispered. Vorsk only chuckled, standing to address his troops. "Let them remember this day. Let them carry the lesson with them." The refugees were too afraid to move as the soldiers turned and marched back toward their ship. The whine of the engines filled the air as the vessel lifted off, leaving only silence in its wake. Dust swirled over Eleanor's still form, and then her communicator crackled to life. Somewhere across the void of space, thousands of miles away, a signal had been sent. A secure channel, one that no Empire forces could intercept. A voice, deep, controlled, terrifying in its quiet fury, spoke. Through the static, "Eleanor?" The silence that followed was deafening. A heartbeat, then another, and then that same voice, now like the promise of a storm, uttered only 4 words. "They will pay for this." The war had been over for him. Until now. Roderick Kane stood in his private quarters aboard the Solace, the personal frigate he had sworn never to use again. It was an old warship, battle-worn yet formidable, much like the man who owned it. The transmission had come through less than an hour ago. The moment he heard Eleanor's last words, something inside him cracked. Not grief, not yet. That would come later. Now there was only rage. Cold, focused, absolute. He had spent the last decade trying to forget what he was, a man who had built his reputation on systematic annihilation. Entire fleets had burned under his command. Planets had surrendered at the mere mention of his name. Yet for all his victories, the one thing he had never expected to find in this cruel galaxy was Eleanor. And now she was gone. The Zelthari Empire had made a mistake. A deep breath steadied him. He pressed his hands against the metal console before him, fingers curling against the cool surface. He would need resources, men, ships, a plan. The Empire was the largest force in the known galaxy, a sprawling beast that crushed all who stood against it. No one sane would challenge them alone, but Kane had never been like other men. The door slid open behind him with a soft hiss. Elias Hartman stepped inside, his movements sharp, disciplined. His uniform bore no insignia anymore, but the way he carried himself, broad shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back, spoke of a lifetime in service. He had been Kane's right hand during the wars, the man who had led battalions into hell and brought them back alive. "You're really doing this," Elias said, his voice low, unreadable. Kane turned, eyes cold as the void. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Elias exhaled slowly, watching him. "No, I just thought I'd have more time to convince you it was suicide." Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elias sighed. "We're outnumbered, outgunned. Earth won't back you, not officially. They won't risk open war with the Zelthari." Kane's gaze darkened. "Then I won't give them a choice." The silence stretched between them. It was an old dance, the two of them standing on the precipice of war, knowing the cost before the first shot was ever fired. Elias crossed his arms. "I put out feelers. Not everyone's forgotten you. The old guard, the ones who fought under you before, some of them are still around. Mercenaries, exiles, men with nothing left to lose. They'll fight if you ask." Kane nodded. That was the first step. He would need more than soldiers, though. He needed a war machine. Dr. Kieran Blake was waiting for him in the ship's engineering bay. The man hadn't aged well since Kane had last seen him, his once dark hair now streaked with grey, his sharp features drawn with sleepless nights. But his mind remained as sharp as ever. "You're insane," Blake muttered, pacing the room. "Absolutely, certifiably insane." Kane leaned against the nearest console. "That's never been a secret." Blake ran a hand through his greying hair. "They have an empire, Kane. We have a handful of old war dogs and whatever scraps we can pull from the black markets." He gestured wildly to the massive ship schematics floating in the air beside him. "They have fleets, do you understand? Armadas, planets. You can't just—" Kane cut him off. "I don't need to destroy their empire. I need to break them." Blake stilled, his brow furrowed, eyes narrowing. He had known Kane long enough to recognize when the man was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Kane continued, voice measured. The Zelthari operate on fear. They rule because people believe resistance is impossible, but fear is a double-edged blade. If I can turn it against them, if I can make them afraid, then I don't need to burn every world they own. I just need to make them bleed. Blake let out a slow, unsteady breath. You're planning a psychological war. Kane inclined his head. I'm planning a reckoning. Blake stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned back to his workbench, fingers moving over a data pad. I have something, he said, almost reluctantly. A prototype I was working on before Earth signed the truce with the Zelthari. High-speed cloaking, AI-enhanced targeting systems, self-repairing hull. The kind of ship that shouldn't exist. Kane's interest sharpened. You built it, Blake scoffed. Of course I built it. You think I sit around all day making toasters? Kane stepped forward, eyes scanning the rotating model on the holoscreen. It was sleek, predatory, nothing. Like the heavy, lumbering warships the Zelthari favored. It was a scalpel against their sledgehammer. I need it ready in 2 weeks, Kane said. Blake nearly choked. 2 weeks? Kane, You have 2 weeks. Blake threw up his hands, muttering something about insanity and suicidal tendencies. But he didn't say no. The pieces were falling into place. Admiral Silas Reeve was the last obstacle. Kane found him in a private office aboard Earth's orbital command station, the walls lined with star maps, fleet deployments, and defense protocols. Reeve had always been a cautious man, favoring diplomacy over war, but he had also been a soldier once. You're asking me to condone an act of war, Reeve said, rubbing his temples. You're asking me to throw Earth into a conflict we barely recovered from. Kane didn't blink. I'm not asking for permission. I'm giving you the courtesy of knowing what comes next. Reeve sighed heavily. And if I tried to stop you? Kane's expression didn't change. You won't. Reeve studied him for a long moment. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Damn you, Kane. Kane turned to leave, but Reeve's voice stopped him. If you do this, there's no coming back, Reeve said quietly. You know that, don't you? Kane's jaw tightened. There was no coming back the moment they killed her. He walked out without another word. By the time he reached the Solace, the first wave of mercenaries had already arrived. Hardened men, scarred and silent, standing at attention as Elias called out orders. In the distance, Blake was overseeing the refit of his prototype warship, directing engineers like a man possessed. It had begun. Kane stood on the bridge, gazing out at the endless black beyond. A message was already being sent, scattered across every network, every encrypted channel, every back-alley mercenary outpost in the galaxy. A declaration, a warning, a promise. To the Zelthari Empire, you took my wife, now I take your empire. The first strike was precise, calculated, devastating. The Zelthari mining world of Vorten 6 had never known war. It was a fortress in name alone, guarded not by warships but by the blind assumption that no one would be foolish enough to attack it. The planet supplied nearly 30% of the Empire's refined fuel, the lifeblood of its ever-expanding fleet. Without it, supply chains would buckle, warships would stall, and fear, the very thing that kept their rule intact, would begin to fester in the hearts of their own people. Kane had chosen it carefully. He stood on the bridge of the Revenant, the prototype warship that was never meant to exist, watching the distant glow of Vorten 6's industrial complex flicker against the abyss. The ship hummed beneath him, its cloaking system seamlessly bending light around its frame, leaving it nothing more than a shadow in the dark. Beside him, Elias Hartman surveyed the battlefield with an old soldier's grim satisfaction. They don't see us coming, he murmured. Kane's lips barely curved. They never do. In the void around them, his forces lurked, patched together mercenary fleets, rogue warships, and stolen cruisers, an armada of the forgotten and the damned. They weren't polished or disciplined, but they were hungry. Men like Kane and Elias had once commanded legions with proper ranks and banners. Now they commanded ghosts. Kane activated the comm. His voice, steady as iron, echoed across every ship. No survivors, no mercy. Then the war began. The first explosions rippled through the mining facilities in eerie silence, brilliant eruptions of fire and debris that sent shockwaves through the planet's thin atmosphere. The Zelthari defense turrets activated too late, their sluggish targeting systems failing to lock onto the invisible enemy tearing through them. The Revenant led the charge, slipping past their feeble security grids like a knife between ribs. The ship's rail cannons roared, sending hypersonic rounds straight into fuel depots, igniting them from within. The sky itself seemed to burn. From orbit, the Zelthari scrambled, a handful of patrol ships deployed, sleek and deadly in their own right but unprepared. Kane's forces tore through them before they could even call for reinforcements. By the time the Zelthari High Command received word of the attack, Vorten 6 was little more than a cinder drifting in the void. The first crack in the Empire had formed. The response was immediate. Grand Admiral Zerathis, one of the most feared tacticians in the Zelthari military, mobilized a fleet to hunt down the insurgents. He dismissed Kane as a rogue terrorist, a relic of a past war clawing at an empire too vast to be shaken. He sent his warships to every sector, stamping out insurrection before it could spread. But Kane was never where they expected him to be. One strike became 2, then 4, then a dozen. Supply routes collapsed. Shipyards went silent. Every week a new outpost fell, their officers found executed, their banners burned. He never lingered, never held territory. He was a spectre, a phantom, his forces striking. Like lightning before disappearing into the abyss, and then the fear began. Zerathis realized his mistake too late. This wasn't just an insurgency. This wasn't a rebellion. This was a systematic dismantling of the Empire's foundations. Power had never been their ships, their soldiers, or even their conquests. It had been control. It had been the certainty that none would dare rise against them. Kane had shattered that certainty. He made sure they saw the wreckage. The Zelthari propaganda networks, once a tool of control, were now his weapon. He left wrecked warships drifting, near trade routes, bodies frozen in the vacuum of space, their armor marked with a single symbol, his insignia, a reminder that vengeance had a name. To the Zelthari Empire, his broadcast echoed across the stars, translated into every known language. So you are not untouchable. The fractures widened. Within the Empire, whispers began to spread. The governors of outlying worlds questioned their safety. Some quietly began reducing their tributes, hoarding resources instead of sending them to the central war machine. Fleet commanders, once loyal without question, now hesitated before engaging, knowing they could be walking into a trap, and not all Zelthari agreed with the war. General Kyle Dorn had seen enough. A veteran of the Empire's many conquests, he had believed in its supremacy. He had led campaigns that crushed entire civilizations, believing it was the only path to order. But Kane was something else. Kane was not a rebel grasping for power. He was not a warlord seeking dominion. He was vengeance sharpened into something unstoppable. Dawn watched the reports pile up. The Empire's losses were growing, not just in battle, but in will. Officers were refusing assignments, recruitment. Numbers were dwindling. The fear was no longer among the rebels, it was within their own ranks, and now the Empire's high command was making the same mistake they had made once before. They underestimated Roderick Kane. Dawn knew what was coming. If the Zelthari continued this path, Kane would not stop. He would not be satisfied with disrupting supply lines. He would burn their homeworld. He would take from them what they had taken from him, and Dawn wasn't certain he could blame him. Late. One evening, he stood in his quarters, staring at the flashing red warning messages from High Command. Orders to reinforce the core worlds, to prepare for total war, to crush the insurgency before it reached them. He did not send an acknowledgement. Instead, he sent a message into the void, encrypted and buried within layers of false transmissions. Reached the Revenant in less than an hour. Kane read it once, then twice. His expression did not change, but Elias, standing at his side, knew what it meant the moment he saw the flicker in Kane's eyes. "He's switching sides," Elias murmured. Kane exhaled slowly. Not yet. Elias frowned. Then why reach out? Kane's gaze remained on the message. Because he sees the inevitable. Outside the ship's viewport, the stars stretched endlessly. Somewhere beyond them, the Empire was beginning to understand what they had unleashed. They had started this war. Kane would finish it. Encourage his continued reading, ensure character development, and there should be no headings. ChatGPT said, "The Zelthari. Homeworld burned." Roderick Kane stood on the bridge of the Revenant, watching the flames spread across the surface of Zelrath, the Imperial throne world. The planet's defenses had crumbled faster than even he had anticipated. The moment General Kael Dorn turned his fleet against his own empire, the battle was no longer a war, it was an execution. The Zelthari had ruled through fear. Now, they knew what it meant to be afraid. Outside the viewport, the remnants of the Empire's once mighty armada were little more than wreckage drifting in the void. Kane's forces had struck with precision, dismantling their strongest defensive lines. Before the Zelthari even understood what was happening, the Empire's high command had sent desperate transmissions, calling for reinforcements that would never come. Their outer sectors had abandoned them. Their governors had fled. What was left of their fleets lay in ruins. And yet, Kane felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, only the quiet certainty that this was always how it would end. The moment Eleanor had fallen, this had been inevitable. The Zelthari had taken the one thing that tethered him to peace, and in doing so, they had unleashed the man he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Elias Hartmann stood beside him, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "We've taken the Palace District," he reported. "Their last stronghold is the Imperial Citadel." He hesitated, then added, "Vorsk is there." Kane exhaled slowly, his hands tightening against the console. Commander Vorsk. The man who had pulled the trigger, the man who had looked into Eleanor's eyes and murdered her without a second thought. "The Citadel's shields?" Kane asked. "Failing," Elias said. "Blake's teams hacked their grid. We'll have an opening." In 5 minutes, Kane turned, his expression cold, determined. "I want him alive." Elias nodded once, but there was no need for clarification. He understood what Kane meant. The descent to the planet was chaos. Fires raged through the streets, and the once proud Zelthari banners lay trampled beneath fleeing civilians. The Empire had never considered the possibility of its own downfall. Now its leaders scrambled for escape routes that no longer existed. Kane led the charge toward the Citadel. His soldiers moved like wraiths through the collapsing city, cutting through the last of the Empire's resistance with brutal efficiency. Then they reached the inner sanctum. The massive doors of the Imperial Citadel had been breached, smoke curling. Through the great halls where Zelthari warlords had once plotted the conquests of entire civilizations. Now the halls were empty, save for the bodies of those too stubborn or too foolish to surrender. And there, at the heart of it all, was Vorsk. The once proud commander was a shadow of himself. His armor was dented, his weapons gone. He had retreated to the throne room, where the Zelthari Emperor himself should have been, only to find it abandoned. The Emperor had fled long before the first strike had landed, leaving his people to suffer his fate. Vorsk turned as Kane entered, his reptilian eyes narrowing. He had no words, no pleas. He must have known deep down that this moment had been coming since the instant he had raised his weapon against Eleanor. Kane stopped a few feet away, silent, studying the man. Vorsk sneered. "Do it then." Kane didn't move. Elias stepped. Closer, his rifle leveled. "You don't get to choose when you die, filth." But Kane still did not move. For the first time, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The blood, the destruction, the vengeance that had carried him this far. And yet, standing here looking at the man who had destroyed his world, he realized something. Vorsk had never been the true enemy. The Zelthari Empire had been built on cruelty, on conquest, on the belief that no force could ever challenge them. Vorsk had not created that system. He had only served it. Killing him would be justice, but it would not bring peace. Kane took a slow breath, then lowered his weapon. Vorsk's eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What?" Kane turned to Elias. Throw him in the cell block. Let him watch as everything he swore to protect turns to dust. Elias hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. The soldiers moved in, dragging Vorsk away, his struggles meaningless. Cain watched him go, his mind already turning to what came next. The Empire was finished. The Zelthari had ruled through fear, and now that fear had turned against them. Their fleets were broken. Their leaders had abandoned them. The galaxy would not remember them as conquerors, but as cowards who fell to a single man's wrath. But Cain knew this war was not just about destruction. Something had to come next. He turned to General Kyle Dorn, who stood near the ruined throne, silent. The Zelthari officer had made his choice when he defected, but he had yet to speak a word about what came after. Cain met his gaze. The Empire is gone. Dorn inclined his head. It is. You can either let it collapse into chaos, Cain continued, voice measured, or you can build something better. Dorn's jaw tightened. And you? Cain exhaled, glancing at the ruined halls around him. I came here to destroy them. That's done. Dorn studied him, as if searching for something. You would just walk away? Cain looked past him. Past the destruction, past the war. He had never been a ruler, he had never wanted power. He had wanted revenge, and now that it was his, there was only one thing left for him to do. Burn the banners, he said at last. Make sure no one remembers their name. Then he turned and walked away. He left the Revenant in Elias's hands. He left the remnants of the Empire to Dorn, and he left the battlefield for the last time. There was only one place left for him to go. A quiet world on the edge of known space. A place untouched by war, by empires, by vengeance. He stood before a simple grave, marked only by a single inscription, Eleanor Cain. He sank to one knee, resting his hand against the stone. The weight of it all settled in his chest, heavier than any warship, any battle, any empire. The fire inside him had burned so brightly, so fiercely, that he had nearly forgotten what it meant to feel anything else. For the first time since she had died, he closed his eyes and let himself grieve.